Well, welcome to Round the Table with Christian Concern. It's great to see you and looking forward to the conversation today. Following on from a conference we organised in London on Tuesday called Is the Government's Ban on Conversion Therapy Safe? And I'm delighted we've got two conference speakers with us in the studio, so to speak, today. Caris Mosley, who is a policy researcher and expert in the subject, and Mike Davidson, from Coercion Trust and the International Federation for Therapeutic and Counselling Choice. I should say that Caris is also on the advisory panel, I think, is that right? For the
board,
IFTC, which organised the conference on Tuesday in London. And I was there, and there were some fantastic presentations, I have to say, and some really good scientific evidence was presented. And lots of good discussion and questions as well. And we should have the videos up online, hopefully next week, I think, Mike, you're saying, aren't you?
So.
Of all the various talks, and we'll send around links to those and stuff and make you aware of that in due course. But I wanted to spend the time just now discussing some of these issues. And if you've got questions or comments you want to pose and you're watching live on Facebook or YouTube, you can ask away and we can see your comments there. But there are a number of sort of topics that need to be sort of covered in this discussion. One of them is that the consultation document appears to assume that sexuality is not fluid and cannot change. It actually says in the government's consultation document, that conversion therapy, quote, targets an innate aspect of personhood. Karen, tell us your response to that phrase in the consultation document.
Well, I think it's very striking because the government doesn't usually use this concept of personhood, or let alone an innate aspect of it. And I'm not sure if that's because of the principle that we shouldn't make windows into men's souls when legislating. So talking about personhood is an interesting shift from talking about innate sexuality or innate gender identity. Although it's closer to the latter. And it reminds me a little bit of when I first got involved here at Christian Concern, I found a little bit of survey evidence suggesting that in the culture, the concept of gender identity had replaced the idea that we all have a soul. Okay, I can't prove that, but it's everywhere, gender identity now. And we're all assumed when we answer government forms and so on that we have a gender identity, even though many of us don't believe that. And think it's a belief that we should be free to accept or reject. And so I think that's very important, that shift, because the government has, in its small print in the past, accepted that belief that you have a different gender identity to your body is a belief. And so this shift then to personhood, I think actually enshrines it all over again. And of course, taking the idea of innate same-sex sexual attraction and orientation and fixed and unchangeable. So I think that's the first thing I want to say about that, is the whole worldview shift that's very powerful. And the second is we know that people who want to ban actually admit their sexuality is fluid. The people over at Pink Therapy, for example, do admit that when you look at some of what they say and some of what was said.
They admit that sexuality is fluid.
For most people, yes. There was that roundtable on this topic with the Department of Health in 2014, and the head of Pink Therapy actually said that. And nobody's pretending that sexuality is changeable in every person. It's not that simple. But this notion of, so I think what's really going on is a battle over who can talk about sexual changeability or fluidity, as it's currently called, and on what grounds. And that's partly a moral battle and a battle about social policy.
Mike, what's your reflections on this?
Well, I think the government has really taken a bit of a lonely road here, because I can't think of any other professional body in the world that is making genetics the basis of sexual so-called orientation. Most of them are much more tentative and talk about a combination of some small contribution from genetics, but mostly it being postnatal.
So is that what innate means in sort of the literature or professional talk? It means it's kind of biologically determined, does it?
Well, that's how I took it when I read that. And I was shocked, actually, to see that, because it's a very bold statement that is not supported.
No, it's an ideological statement, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of like, it shows the government bias, doesn't it? They've got a phrase in their consultation document that says this is an innate aspect of personhood, which kind of, nobody supports that, in fact, in the literature, or in the science.
And it's very much an extension of, this phrase we hear all the time about who a person is. That's who they are. Therefore, they can't change. It's just a different variation.
My identity would be the sort of popular language for this kind of thing, wouldn't it be?
I think so.
But I think there's also a point that's worth making, is the government contradicting itself? Because the Department for Education in England had not long ago brought out guidance prohibiting schools from accepting invited speakers from outside who told or implied children that they could be born in the wrong body. And of course, born in the wrong body was the statement that was always said, with the appearance of being literal, about gender identity. And again, that was a different way of saying that it was an innate aspect of their personhood. Okay, that this person was born.
So let's get on to the evidence though on this. What is the evidence, Mike, that sexuality is fluid, scientific evidence?
Well, where I would start is by looking at the largest of the non-heterosexual minority groups, which would be the mixed attracted persons. We know that is a fact, that they are the largest minority of the non-heterosexual groupings.
Yeah.
And so for me, this is the issue. How come we provide affirmative therapies for those who want to emphasize the homosexual leanings of their mixed attractions, but we do not provide anything that would support those who want to affirm the heterosexual side of their mixed attractions? To me, that's a simple way of looking at this reality. We know that most people who share homosexual feelings are attracted in both ways. And yes, there's also a group of people who are 100% only attracted to the same sex, but they're a small group.
Yeah. I remember seeing a study a few years ago saying lesbians are actually more likely to get pregnant than heterosexuals. Do you remember seeing that? Which kind of betrays this point about they're obviously mixed sex attracted rather than just exclusively same sex attracted, to put it that way.
I think we can also look at the Natsal population studies and note that there are trends that seem to indicate that people who at one point identify as gay move towards heterosexual partnerings, and it's there in the statistics. So it's a kind of, whatever causes it.
Actually, there are studies that show that as people grow older, that happens more often, doesn't it? Is that right, Mike?
I couldn't speak to that, but the point is there's a general trend in that direction. So if that's the case, I would have thought that that's important evidence to look at and to realize that change takes place in one way or another.
Yeah. Karis, what about twin studies and gene studies on this whole subject?
Well, I mean, the twin studies have not shown any, because the purpose of twin studies is very simple, is that if you have, a majority or tendency for both identical twins, both people in these sets of identical twins to show same-sex attraction, then you might be able to say, well, isn't it genetic, surely? But that's not proven to be the case. And then also, I mean, I mentioned in the conference.
So there are lots of twins. Let's just be clear about this, where one is homosexual and the other is heterosexual.
That's right. Twins. That's the point.
So there's clearly not genetic then. If identical twins have different sexual preferences.
No. And that's been done over many years. But I think also the other side of the coin, and that's not being studied, but it's worth as an observation. I made it on Tuesday, is that this is a debate that's happening in Western countries. That's where it started. Of course, it's now spreading elsewhere as well. Campaigners are trying to spread the debate. But Western countries have for many decades had birth rates below replacement level. And of course, even below that, they go up and down. And so in Britain, I think it was 1973 that the birth rate went below replacement level. And although it's fluctuated since then, it's never gone back up above that level. And it's over that time that you've seen, I mean, Mike mentioned the NATSL surveys. These are the big sex surveys done every 10 or so years by the government since the time of Mrs. Thatcher. And they've shown, an increase among younger cohorts, and other surveys have as well, in sort of same-sex attraction and also LGBT identification, which are not actually the same thing. One is about the actual feelings and behavior, and the other is people's social identity, what they choose to live as in terms, and what they choose to say on official forms as well. So that's very important. The correlation internationally between low birth rate, below replacement level, and a higher rising rate. And you would, if same-sex attraction was genetic, you would expect the numbers to have gone down with the lower birth rate over time. Yeah. And I think it's fair to say it's a very rough correlation. That's not what's happened, actually. Yeah. And it's been divergences among the sexes as well. So it used to be that you had more men than women with same-sex attraction. But there's some evidence that now with younger women, it's more common than with younger men. So what's going on? So something else is going on.
And there's been all this search for a gay gene, hasn't there? And
that's not happened for many years. I mean, we remember it used to happen. It was focusing on men rather than women. And I think, obviously, I'm not saying it wasn't a futile study. It was worthwhile doing. But it's also, you got to ask, why are they not asking about the women as well? Again, you would want to balance that out, as they would do for all other issues around genetics.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's kind of like that's the most extraordinary point, isn't it, really, that the government sort of makes this claim about it being innate and unchangeable. So what about the claim that therapy doesn't work? Mike, how would you respond to that, having heard what we heard at the conference this week?
Well, I'm sure there are instances where it doesn't work. It's not an exact science. And I think it depends on how we define it. If we define it as absolute categorical change, then probably the instance is very low in terms of how often that happens. But, change that is good enough to be able to live life in a fulfilled way, well, there are very clear instances of individuals who have had interventions and have gone and lived lives in the way that they want to live them. And I think that's sufficient. So for the first time now, in one of the studies that was mentioned by, produced by Peller and Sutton, one of the writers or the principal researcher was there at the symposium on Tuesday.
This is a study called Sexual Attraction, Fluidity and Wellbeing in Men, a Therapeutic Outcome Study, which you can Google, or maybe one of my colleagues can put the link up online on this. Sexual Attraction, Fluidity and Wellbeing in Men, a Therapeutic Outcome Study. Mike, carry on.
And yes, I think the point about this is that this is a prospective longitudinal study. Most are retrospective studies, and many of them are self-studies.
Right.
So just
explain, what does longitudinal mean for the common person like me?
Over a long period of time. And you start with, you begin to explore what happens to them in this journey rather than looking back and examining historically to something that has already taken place. So you
start before they've had therapy, is that the point? And then you track how things happen.
Yes. And then you can see changes. And the point about this is you not only saw some people significantly change, not everybody, but some people. That was the one thing. But the other thing was their sense of well-being increased dramatically, even those who didn't change. So in other words, the therapy that was offered was beneficial for all sorts of reasons and not just related to the extent to which people changed. This word change, of course, is something that has to be very carefully understood and defined in terms of what is being meant here.
Yes. So that's obviously very good evidence there, isn't it? But there was another study as well, wasn't there, called Efficacy and Risk of Sexual Orientation Change Efforts, a retrospective analysis. So is that one is sort of going back after the fact, is that right, Mike? And then sort of looking at it that way?
Well, Santero and others originally published some research that was, indicative of real evidence of change, but the paper was taken down. So, and there were some issues and objections that people were raising. I think we have to be sensitive to the minefield of getting things published in a peer-reviewed context where, the peer-reviewed is all from one ideological point of view. It makes it increasingly difficult to get anything published if you come from, a different ideological point of view. Anyway, the point about the paper that was referred to and led by Paul Sullins, or he was again the principal researcher here, is that they reworked the evidence, and again it was exonerated, and they were seen to have, that the data was accurate. So in other words, there's a war going on, I think, in the way research is being done. Who allows research to go ahead? Who approves the ethics committee? Who approves the researchers who are going to work on it? Who publishes it? It's all about who's in control here. And so there are really...
The problem is that these kind of science is kind of, well, academia is often a lot more political than we'd like to think it is. I mean, James Caspian's case, which maybe my colleague can post a link to, he wanted to do research about detransitioners at Bosworth University, didn't he? And the research was turned down because it's politically, they didn't want to face the political backlash, right? Not because it's not an interesting topic of study, not because everyone's already researched that before. It's entirely because of politics, right? And that's the challenge you face, isn't it, with this kind of stuff? The research is there, but people don't want to listen to it, and they will find ways not to listen to it.
And that is what I think was quite unique about the symposium on Tuesday, in that some of the people there were researchers who have now gotten their teeth into databases and have begun to check what other researchers are doing.
Yes.
Because what we have to understand is people sometimes do research using databases that are not accessible to other researchers, even.
Right, so you can't
or
check
to the public, so you can't check.
Right.
But in the case of those who were at the symposium, they had found some where they could check. And when they did check and they looked for some of the, most important principles that would guide safe research, they found that there had been violations, and that has enabled them to expose some of the issues. Some of the papers that the government consultation depends on, and there are 3 or 4 of them, well, at least one of them has been shown to be defective in the way the research was done. And to my mind, even if it's 1 out of 4, and it may be more than that, but if they are all falling down at the same point, then surely this is unsafe research. We haven't done enough work on the research level. And I think that's why we asked the question, is the government's ban on conversion therapy safe? And what we're saying when we look at this research is clearly it isn't, because some of the research is pointing out that there are flaws.
I think it's worth saying something also about the research culture. Like, our speakers on Tuesday are mostly from the USA. And of course, it's not just because we like being international. There is no research culture on this issue in the UK. And that is among psychologists. I mean, it's different if I'm trying to do it independently looking for policy purposes. But the fact is that the culture for research has been shut down in this country for the last 14 or 15 years. And that's the effect of the people like the late Michael King, who was a professor, who campaigned to change training for all trainee counsellors and therapists to be based on queer theory. And to get rid of the kind of approaches to therapy and evidence that we've been talking about. And that's a very, very big change, because he was based at University College London and would have, great influence over degree and postgraduate programs in psychology and psychiatry. And so I think we really need to get viewers to understand this, the importance of free speech in order to investigate and solve problems at every level, not just the conversations between therapists, but the research that allows them and goes into their training and their continual professional development.
I think that's absolutely correct, Karis. And it also goes back to the foundations of the Memorandum of Understanding 2013-14, when that was all on the table. And we were prevented from being a part of that, according to Norman Lamb, who at the time was Secretary of State. He said that we were ideologically too different from the group of people who were discussing this. And that's the point. There's no ideological diversity of either. There's just these monocultures that have decided this is the direction, and nobody's allowed to disagree. And that's why research and the principle of inquiry is being substituted for advocacy science. And that's what I'm afraid we are seeing.
Yeah, it's interesting. We just got a comment here from someone called Simon Bosworth on Facebook. Thanks for watching, Simon. He said, I'd love to see one of these idiots, that's us presumably, guys, who believe in conversion therapy, marry their daughter to a gay man who's been, quote, converted. Well, there are lots of ex-gay people who have been married, happily heterosexually married, aren't there? I've met some of them, and there are thousands and thousands of
I think the problem with Simon's comment, I've heard it over the years, is there's something. The problem here is that you want public proof of sexual intercourse. It is private within marriage. And when we have surveys like the ones we were talking about, they're all, if you're going to interview people, it's based on self-report and trust. And there's a decency to it. But I don't think you have a moral right to ask for men to prove their potency publicly.
I'm glad you say that, Karis, because as somebody moving out of homosexual confusion, let's put it that way, when I started to share my story, it could become very hurtful, to be honest, in terms of what I faced in interviews, in terms of the probing questions and things that were asked. When you come from confusion and you find the joy of a pathway that leads to fulfillment, personal fulfillment in your life, and you find freedom from something that has really brought pain and discouragement, well, it's just a wonderful thing. I thought people would celebrate that when I came away from that, but they didn't, not even in the church. I'm afraid the church at the time I was in was pretty embarrassed and said, that's great, thank you for sharing, but don't tell anyone.
I think also there are actually a few wives of ex-gay men who started speaking up because they're fed up with the attitudes we see. And I know that one of them has gone public in the US, and they've talked about how they had another child. He'd been a porn addict. This is someone we know, okay, but it's was now they had another child and the marriage was saved. And you do have, family testimonies like this. And so that's really important, I think.
I see Matthew Grex highlighting that multiple testimonies like this are featured in the X Out Loud book, which is true and worth getting hold of, and shows some of these examples. Thanks for that, Matthew. So moving on to another issue then, Mike. Therapy, people say conversion therapy causes harm or is harmful. Now, I was very struck on Tuesday by taking a part of one of these studies that talked about suicide ideation. And and astonishingly sort of talked about lifetime suicide ideation, not separating whether the ideation of suicide had happened before the therapy or after the therapy. I mean, most extraordinary. And then is it Sullins who'd taken apart this data and actually found that actually the ideation happened more often before the therapy than after therapy in any case? So
to the extent of 65% was before what he calls SOCI, before therapy.
yes.
So that's the danger. If you use the, life suicidality, you're not going to extrapolate how much of it was there before a person enters into a therapeutic relationship. But,
yeah, well, I think as
is.
somebody said, it's a bit like saying we better not treat people for depression, because we've noticed that people who treat for depression tend to be people who've been more depressed than most of the population in their lifetime. I mean, that's crazy.
And that's what surprised me. Some people say, well, there isn't enough research like that. But the point is, again, what we have is unsafe because it hasn't been checked. And because the data is clearly has not been manipulated in a way that takes care of that kind of issue. And it's not only this study. The two others. I think the government mentions 3. It mentions Bloznik, which is the one that you're talking about,
right? Yeah,
Tim, that Sullins dealt with.
Lifetime suicide ideation.
It's also Meanly, and it's also Selways, and their data is not available. So
right, so you can't check it. Yeah,
it's scary.
So where is the evidence of harm? They keep talking about therapies being harmful. Where is the evidence of that, Karis?
Well, I think when if you look at the slides of Caroline Peeler's talk, one of the things she talks about is the tendency to conflate therapeutic and non-therapeutic interventions. And this is a problem with the term conversion therapy, which is kind of a dustbin where you have everything from professional licensed therapists talking to voluntary clients, be they adults or older teenagers, with people going to different religious groups. And some people have better training than others, some people are amateurish, and with crimes. And so, but the first 2 are the most important. When you blur the categories, you could be including all sorts of things. So I still don't want to sit with that study on suicide, and the reworking of the data that Paul Sullins did was quite, and then Christopher Rosick talked as well, was quite extraordinary to be there to listen to it. Although you can guess that that's what's gone on, that they've not, the original researchers had not factored in whether people were
extraordinarily bad to do that. I mean, to me, it sounds completely incompetent to do that.
I know, but the before and during and after,
yeah.
I think that's the key. And I think if it not just suicide, but other issues like other mental health problems. And so this is the fault we had with the Faith and Sexuality study by the Ozanne Foundation in 2018. Of course, the FTCC brought out a very detailed study of that. We had a professional statistician look at that for us. But I think this before and after stuff is absolutely key. Can I say why in terms of the broader policy and the practical human implications? Is because the government is talking now about consent. And it says, well, at the moment, we don't know whether it will change, is saying, well, adults can still consent to conversion therapy, but implying or saying you've got to be signing consent forms. And of course, what they would do with that is really have a health warning and say, you see all this research that we've used as the basis for a consultation, showing these harms, using this study that that Paul Sullins and others have just shown is faulty in using its own data. To have a health warning to say you're going to be going through this therapy that is likely to harm you, that's misleading the public about a public health matter. And that is why Tuesday's symposium, that's one of the most important reasons why Tuesday's papers are so important, I think. Because what's going to happen is that churches and that have counselling and therapy on their premises and other therapists are going to try and cover their bases. And they're going to have to engage with the evidence that our speakers gave on Tuesday, in my opinion, which helps them and which provides good training for them as well. But will the government listen? And will the government take seriously consent forms used by therapists and counsellors based on the research we've provided?
Tim, I think, your question, where is the harm? Where is the evidence of harm? Well, it's a really good question. So we've had more than one BBC report claim that people who've come to Core Issues Trust have been harmed.
Right.
But here's the issue. When you eventually find out who it is who are making these claims, because they're invariably anonymous, you find A, they may not have been a client. They may have just sent a few emails. And there are no complaints that have been lodged here about any harm. There have been no complaints that we're aware of registered in psychotherapist offices or in professional mental health bodies. Nobody has gone to the police. So it's a very good question. Where is the evidence of harm? It's
and furthermore, what's striking to me as well is the studies that we mentioned and some other studies as well also say very clearly no evidence of harm, don't they? I mean, in the studies that they do of people who've gone through this kind of therapy, they say we couldn't find any evidence of harm, and actually most people reported it as beneficial. So the scientific studies is not finding harm from this, is it?
No, they aren't. And well, let's see the evidence and let's track it back. Even Samuel Brinton in the United Nations, when he stood there and claimed that the US was breaching its convention on torture because it allows so-called conversion therapy, he claimed to have been harmed by a therapist. But it didn't take long to realize that actually he couldn't name the therapist. And it was established established that he had actually been to a therapist. Even his father questioned it. And
that therapy was so memorable, he couldn't remember the therapist. I get it.
Yeah, but that narrative still, exists and resounds. And on the basis of that testimony, this whole notion of torture was brought into this narrative.
Crikey.
And I'm afraid it's the same thing with the harm. There may have been harms, but if there are harms, they can be dealt with. They can be, they can go through the correct channels. But claiming harm and, actual harm are two different things.
Yeah, and Karis, you've got a point here, haven't you? Because do they call it grey research or something?
Grey literature. That's a standard term in policy research. I think it's a bit of a, if something's not been peer reviewed or hasn't been published by a government yet, but is in the making. So, it can conclude lots of different things, including things like think tanks or drafts of work, journalism. It's not that clear, to be quite honest. But yes, it's interesting that the Coventry University researchers, they're the people who did the study the government is using. They actually had a section on grey literature, which I think is a good idea to have it. Although they excluded a lot of literature that they perhaps should have looked at, the kind of things we were talking about on Tuesday. And in that, they do talk about harm, and they talk about the well, they don't use the words, but that's what they really are referring to, the undercover journalism done in this country to try and find evidence of harm. And that is, we've got to understand this from the policy perspective. That is how this whole campaign started 12 years ago. And we were there at the conference with Joseph Nicolosi, a conference of professional psychotherapists who know what they're doing, not just amateurs. And the journalists come in, first of all, pretended to want to train as a therapist, actually, and then pretended to want to be a client and got hold. And we know the history. They entrapped a therapist. But the bottom line was they did record what was the conversation that was had, and they wrote it up in the newspaper. We haven't heard all of the recording, and we rarely do. But basically, it boils down to they were offended by words that would have been used, similar words that would have been used to a client who truly wanted to be there, who were truly unhappy with same-sex attraction or gender confusion, and who had a positive motivation, perhaps a belief in creation and marriage, to be there and to move away from these things. And it's really underlying is this sense of a right not to be offended and feeling harmed by words they consider offensive. I think that's the first thing before we even talk about this. I
So
mean, I
even
think that
those
scientific...
allegations of harm made in the press by undercover journalists doing sting operations, the harm that they're claiming is they said things I disagreed with.
Yes. Now, that doesn't mean, I'm not saying, having said that, that's the big framework, okay, the logic of it. By saying that, I'm not also implying that I agree with all the words that have been used. Okay, that's a matter for discussion and debate. And again, the key in terms of policy is allowing the freedom for, be it therapists or counselors or church leaders, to solve the problems through looking at evidence, to getting people together, to interviewing them, through having proper processes in your organization. It's a huge jump to go from being offended and also being dishonest and deceiving these caregivers to campaigning to pass a criminal law.
Yeah,
that's a huge jump. And especially because, like I said at the beginning, we don't have this proper research culture in the psychological disciplines in the UK. And the other thing is that the psychotherapeutic professions are not very regulated in the UK. So it's a massive jump. Even if viewers are just tuning in and they're not really very interested, the framework of what's going on should really worry them as a precedent for pastoral care in other areas.
Yeah. So, and of course, the other thing that's sort of paradoxical about this, or ironic about this, is they talk about that conversion therapy is harmful. So you're not allowed to challenge, according to the proposal, you won't be allowed to challenge a child's transgender identity. So you can only affirm it, and then you take them down a harmful path, which is puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones, and then all this medical treatment that actually is harmful and has long-term effects for the children. And that's allowed, and talking therapy with no evidence of harm is going to be criminalized. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing, isn't it, in this?
I think it's very strange. I think it's difficult. There are obviously different games being played in this consultation, but it's especially weird what's happening here with gender assignment for children, given the price signal that was given. For example, the Department of Education in England saying you can't say to a child that you're born in the wrong body. So that was moving in the right direction. And we've also got these court cases as well on these issues, like the ongoing case around Kira Bell and the Tavistock. And also the caste review hasn't finished. And of course, there's a wider discussion now about should this consultation not be postponed, because the caste review on the gender identity service for children and adolescents is still ongoing. And so the government shouldn't be jumping the gun on something so obviously controversial. Gender reassignment is not true medicine. It is experimental, and there is increasing mounting evidence of the physical and really cognitive harms to young people taking cross-sex hormones as well after having taken puberty blockers. So I don't know what's going on, whether the government is trying to say, because what it's doing is bringing back this absolute children's rights framework where the child decides everything and the parents have no responsibilities to bring up the child as a member of his or her sex. And no right to do so. They just have to let the child decide. That's not parenting. That's anarchy. And again, that goes back to the wider philosophy and worldview issues. But I don't know whether the government has decided to say we're going to criminalize both encouraging a child going down, living as a member of their sex, or living categorically pretending to be a member of the opposite sex, in order to play off both sides against each other. But it's a very dangerous game to play them off against each other.
It's very interesting also that the government talks about this ban being useful, universal. In other words, going in both directions. You can't so-called convert somebody from gay to straight, but you can't convert somebody presumably from straight to gay, kind of thing. And similarly with transgender. So if that's how they want to go, then surely that means they're going to have to completely reconfigure their memorandum of understanding, because that's a document that seems to encourage really only one direction.
Yeah, only affirming.
That's another game, I think. I think that's said in 2 or 3 places in the consultation that they would punish changes the other way. I have some idea of what's really going on there, but I wouldn't take the government's word for that. They're trying to pretend that they're being even-handed.
Yeah. So finally, then, just a few more minutes. There is this whole issue of coercion, And the government's saying, well, we've got to ban these coercive practices, coercion in this. How would you respond to that, Mike?
Well, who is doing this coercion? Who is being coercive in the country? That can surely be dealt with by existing frameworks within the psychological and mental health bodies.
Yeah.
I
Existing
don't
laws
see
as
what
well.
the issue is. That's why banning is inappropriate. Regulating, ensuring people have good access to professional development training, make sure that people have appropriate supervisors. That seems to me to be a much better way to go. But what they have done, rather, is excluded anybody who has a different point of view from training in this field, and not allowing anybody to hold a different point of view when it comes to how a therapist can work. Now,
and therapy is always done by consent anyway, isn't it? I mean, no therapist can coerce someone into having therapy with them. It's a consensual thing. The client says, I want to be helped, and you say, okay, I'll try and help you with this.
I think the point they're making is that because of what they term systemic internalized homophobia, individuals do not have the wherewithal to be able to discern whether or not they're being pushed into something or not. But I have to say, certainly the clients I've dealt with over the years are well informed and do not talk about having grown up in a homophobic society. Just the opposite. They've often been supported by their parents or friends. The problem comes when they want to go in the other direction. That's often when they experience opposition from people, oddly enough.
Right. So leaving their LGBT lifestyle behind.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think this concept of coercion is something that's been thrown as a spanner in the works. And I think it's helpful to see a few things. First of all, in the history of psychotherapy, Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychotherapy, we don't have to agree with all his views, but this point is important. He used to write up cases that of people he'd seen. And one of them was a teenage girl who had come, her parents had brought her, and she had same-sex attraction. And she seemed very reluctant to be in therapy. And he actually talked to the parents and said, nothing's going to happen, just because you're unhappy. And she doesn't really want to be here, basically. And that's inherent in the mentality of therapists. And I know that in IFTC, we've heard therapists talk, and therapists do talk about how they deal with reluctant clients who are often minors, and their parents think you'll be good for them. I don't think that's coercion necessarily. It's more like pressure or influence, because parents have authority over their children. And I think the key, therefore, first of all, therapists have appropriate ways of talking to a client like that, to show them that therapy is not coercive and they're welcome to have a talk, and to gently prise them away from parents in a way who might be overbearing. But I think one of the key words behind this not being talked about is authority. Authority is a moral thing about knowing right and wrong and good and evil. And ultimately, we believe it resides in God. And that means that no human being has absolute authority over another, which is very freeing. But I'm very suspicious when the government keeps on going on about coercion, and it's a term that's used around the world. Is it really a proxy for attacking Christian understandings of authority, ultimately of God, mediated through church practices and the belief in authority of the Bible? Because people who come and want help for same-sex attraction, when they're unhappy with it, they believe in very often the authority of the Bible. They're moving in that direction. And they believe in the rightness of marriage between one man and one woman. And as an authoritative and good statement written in Genesis, one that Christ accepted. So I think that we've got to be careful. There's a word game, there's a suppressed word game being played here around the world. And I think many more people need to understand that.
Yeah. Well, listen, well done to both of you for exposing a lot of this stuff. This remarkable stuff, some of it that's being exposed here, and incredible how lacking in evidence the government consultation is, and the government proposals are, and even contrary to science in some cases. I'd just like to say to anybody watching, if you haven't yet responded to the consultation on your own behalf, please do. We've got guidance up on our website. I think it's the front page of our website. The link is there. And you've got till the 10th of December. So I think it closes 2 weeks today, actually, doesn't it? The consultation. So do that. It takes about 30 minutes or so. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for spending time with us, Mike and Karis. Thank you for watching and listening as well. And look forward to catching up with you again next Friday as well. Okay. So follow us on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook from Christian Concern. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Bye.